So let's move right ahead with our network innovation panel. I'll introduce the panel moderator, and he can take over from there and tell you a little bit about the various speakers on his panel. So John Antonio is the Chief Strategy Officer of IDX, and he's also the company's former CTO. He's responsible for developing innovation-first strategies to accelerate and advance IDX's leadership in market-disrupting technology infrastructure solutions. He is a 30-plus year really 30-plus years? Oh. 30-plus year veteran of the technology industry, having worked in software, consulting, and technology integration sectors for market leaders such as Oracle, Accenture, and Fujitsu. Please join me in welcoming John Antonio.
So, can you hear me? I guess that's the first question. I can hear myself good. I guess I was going to do my own intro, so I guess I can move forward from there. A couple things I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about, I guess, who I am, just to put some context around it in terms of the people that also that we're talking to here. So IDX is we'll call ourselves a boutique technology solutions provider, and we've been in the, I guess we'll call it the virtualization software defining business for probably the last 10 years, and we really focused on the data center space. And about 3.5 years ago, I guess, we kind of made a decision thinking that there was a very good likelihood that this same type of strategy and transformational occurrence is going to happen in the network. So we made that decision that we were going to go and make some big bets in that space. So as a result, we've made a transformation in many ways as an organization to really focus on helping organizations like this and working with organizations like yourself and trying to bring that transformation into the network and into organizations that are really focusing on trying to evolve where and what the networks are capable of doing. So with that, I'll move on to having our individual panelists giving their opening remarks, and we'll start with you, James, from ADVA.
All right, thank you very much. So hi everybody, my name is James Buchanan. I'm with ADVA Optical. So I'm, I guess, a graduate of the Nortel University in Ottawa over many years, like some of the members here. And I've ended up working for ADVA, which is a German-based telecommunications company. But we made a strong pivot into the NFV space through the acquisition of a company called Overture Networks, which was based down in Raleigh, North Carolina. And they had bet the company entirely on NFV, specifically Edge NFV, so as a CPE type platform. And we're the lucky inheritors of that investment. And it seems to be just coming to fruition now. So I thought I'd just spend a couple minutes introducing it, because I think there's a wide range of backgrounds and interests here. NFV is a very unusual technology, because it's sort of the offspring of a wave that crashed through the world about 40 years ago, and a committee by 30 telcos, in the sense that the computing wave, the PC computing wave that we're all familiar with from taking over the office and the data center environment, where instead of having a monolithic appliance, you instead had Intel chips, an OS layer put together by some system vendor, and then applications stacked on top. It's a great model. Of course, we all know it took over the world. Most of you are sitting playing with your PCs of various kinds right now. But that wave never crashed into telecom, largely because processing power didn't permit it at the time. But now the processing power has caught up, and it took a bit of a kick from a white paper dropped about 5.5 years ago by ETSI, the European Telecommunications Standards Institute. So hardly an exciting group to get innovation going in the world, but they did. They gave this whole thing a bit of a kick, and that was a starting gun that we all heard. And since then, there have been forests felled for all the marketing that's come out. This is NFV, that is NFV, we're virtualizing, blah, blah, blah. And as with many big waves, the whole industry sort of disappeared into that chasm, the gap between when the excitement fades and revenue starts. So I'm happy to report now that I think we're just emerging from the chasm, specifically in the Edge NFV space where we specialize. So I just sort of wanted to talk a little bit around where I see the industry. Hopefully it's very close to where you guys see the industry, or maybe it'll be more entertaining if you see see it very differently. So what has happened? We have seen the market declare itself for open solutions. So initially in the first few years, some of the traditional vendors, whom I won't name by name, but they have teal-colored boxes or blue-colored boxes or so on, have done a bit of a head fake towards these open solutions in the sense that they'll say, well, I'm still going to give you my proprietary solution, but I'll put an x86 server in there and you can run something on top. But it wasn't really open. At the end of the day, you were still locked into these guys one way or another through their solutions. And that really hasn't caught on. I mean, these guys are powerful vendors in the marketplace. They can make certain things happen. But at the end of the day, the big wave hasn't bought into that model. And we are seeing now CIOs, in particular from end enterprises, really digging their heels in and saying, no, this is not what we meant. We really want open. I want to see x86 plus Linux, maybe a little bit of middleware and applications on top. I care. You think, well, that's great. I'm glad they care. Why would a CIO of an enterprise actually care how a service provider actually delivered the service? And there are a couple reasons that seem to be percolating through to us. One is they see proprietary boxes the same way service providers see them in the sense that this is lock-in. Right? If you, Mr. Service Provider, roll out a 500-site network on proprietary boxes, I'm going to have to be really angry to bother getting you out of my network. Right? It's a high barrier. It's a high switching cost. Where if it's just an x86 and you're running applications that I told you what I wanted to run, I want to run this firewall or this SD-WAN, and I just said you run it. Sorry, you, you run it.
We need more clients.
Then I know if we get angry at you, I can go and find somebody else to run it because I had a lot more control in the design of that solution. So I think it's as simple as that, and it's a little bit of an emotional thing. But we're seeing it. We're seeing the same enterprise deals coming at us now as a vendor through multiple channels, through service providers, through resellers, and so on. So it's very clear to us around the world, and this is EMEA, this is North America, Latin America, that the enterprises have dug in and said, this is what I want, and I will buy from the service provider who can give it to me in the flavor I want. So I think that's the first reason that the end market, the only one that really matters, the enterprises, is declaring. And the second is they think it is open compute, and just as on our desktops we end up running things that we didn't expect to run when we bought that computer, so too these guys are finding they can do new things with this telecommunications x86 platform. And things like enterprise LTE is now, by licensing, possible to run an LTE network within your four walls and then roam onto the national carrier of your choosing, saving minutes, et cetera. So that one's taking off in the market, or virtualized encryption is taking off in the market as well. So the whole promise of open compute, letting me run multiple applications on top, seems to be coming to fruition.
Perfect. Brahim.
I'm not sure I liked all the free stuff James just gave away on behalf of the operators because, but thank you for that notion, James. It was really nice as an ex-TELUS person. By the way, there's a picture of Edmonton in the winter that I could lie and say I took it myself, but it was one of my colleagues, but I thought you should see it because it's really not as pretty as the picture depicts it, even though I do live there. Really what we're talking about is network innovation, and there's two things that are happening. And I thought I'd talk about our industry in general rather than TELUS. The price per bit is dropping dramatically on hardware. But the reality is we're not able to move together as an industry to relate the total cost of ownership. That's one. And the other one that I think is denying innovation is I think it requires an end-to-end ecosystem for the network. So for example, there's still a layer 1 solution and a layer 2, layer 3 solution, and then there's the application layers. There's now a chief digital officer everywhere that does their own transformation. So I think it's very important that when we look at a sample, either rally around the subscriber, to be honest, or rally around the bit. Like you need something that does not change, that makes sense, and be able to provide open interfaces for people to innovate and contribute. So when somebody says, I've got a collapsed metro or a wireless wireline network, frankly speaking, that's underwear. The actual subscriber does not care. So it really becomes important when we talk about network innovation to the Is it to a startup? Is it to a user? Or is it to our total cost of ownership? And I think sometimes we mix them all together in the name of cool technology. So one of the things that we're excited about is I think with software-defined networking, we should be able to run the same layers with the same protocol. So for the first time in a very long time, they all speak English, which is SDN based. And the same at other layers. So I'm pretty excited, it's wonderful. I think there's a massive retooling required by our workforces and by people to benefit. But more importantly, for us to interface at an innovation layer, we need the same APIs. We have to speak the same language and be able to support it. So that's my 2 cents on where we're heading.
So Ray, pass it on to you.
So I'm going to take the opportunity and talk a little bit about Allstream, because Allstream has changed quite a bit last couple of years, and I get a lot of questions, who is Allstream and where are we heading from here? So a couple of things, just a little bit of reminders. Last year, actually January 2016, time flies, we were acquired by Zayo Group. In March 2017, Zayo Group acquired a company called Electrical Lightwave. It's a local regional CLEC out of the northwest of the United States. And they were the largest CLEC in the United States at the time of the acquisition. The combined companies goes by the brand of Allstream going forward. And really, our focus is in business market, is really through innovation and really to bring a competitive approach for that business telecom market. That's really our focus going forward. One of the other things we want to highlight some of, really we strive about innovation, innovative services to drive cloud collaboration and leveraging network agility and flexibility of choice. That's really the new Allstream going forward. The combination of the new Allstream, which is a combination of ELI and the old Allstream, is North America cross-border CLEC with 70,000 business customers. And a little bit, we talk about innovation and network. It's not a choice for our industry. It's not a choice for Allstream. So it's really about, we need to innovate to stay on top of, evolve to drive the business need of our customers. Really, that's what we have to do. And if we step back as an Allstream for a few minutes to give a few examples of what we've done over the last few years, we were first to introduce SIP trunking in Canada. And that was part of our ability to try to innovate the market and drive new services to the customers. But also I want to highlight innovation doesn't only come from networks. It really comes from network, customer models, customer service model, and a business model. And we've seen recently a lot of disruptive industry coming based on the new business model and leveraging technology to drive the new business model. And some of those things, being in the industry for 20 years, focused on technology for most of my career, except the recent role, we've seen a lot of evolution. I don't want to date myself, but I was part of the MPLS launch and the shutdown of the frame relay. But at the same time, over the 20 years, a lot of evolution has happened, will continue to happen. But I believe the era, what's coming up front of us, what's exciting, is really about taking the network to the next level to be able to allow softer control and give more flexibility to drive businesses to meet the customer and business needs.
Cool. Interesting that frame relay is something that we have to think about, that if you know about it, that makes you really old.
I was going to make
I thought you had to have the punch cards in your pocket to determine that you actually been in this business for a while. Anyway, David, you actually represent an interesting perspective, I think, here, in the fact that you are essentially running a private-public business, I suppose, not for profit, trying to basically extend network access into areas that have historically been underserved. So please let us know your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great introduction. And I think when you talk about network innovation, you're probably primarily thinking about my colleagues here, and I'm kind of the outlier sitting on the end. Outside of the GTA, what I would suggest is outside the GTA and major urban centers in Canada, network innovation is really about business model innovation. about getting the network out to the people that need to access it in order to participate in the modern economy. So really briefly, I'll give you a little bit of a sense of who we are and what we've done. We're from Eastern Ontario. The project's called the Eastern Ontario Regional Network. So Eastern Ontario, we're talking about 55,000 square kilometers, about 1 million people. We're a little bigger than the province of Nova Scotia. And way back in the mid-2000s, the Warden's Caucus, which are the upper tiers of government, they recognized that people didn't have access to internet and they needed it in order to participate in the economy. So they looked at different business models and ways that they could address this problem, and they put $10 million on the table. They went to the federal and provincial governments and they said, we need to make sure that we can invest in this in Eastern Ontario. And they were able to get $55 million from the provincial government and $55 million from the federal government. We put that together. We went out to the market and we raised over $62 million from the private sector. And we built backhaul, we invested in satellite coverage and last mile. And those are some of the statistics that you see in terms of what we were able to do in terms of network investment in Eastern Ontario. And since we completed that original project in 2015, we've seen over $100 million in additional investment into the networks. But can you switch the, sorry. That's great. And so why do we care? Well, we thought we were being pretty proactive back in 2010, establishing 10 meg down, 1 meg up standard in a wireless environment that hadn't really been happening. But you can see from the transition over time, we were able to achieve our objectives, but we know from our partner providers in Eastern Ontario, bandwidth and speed requirements are growing 50% plus year over year. We're growing a little faster than the national average. We were very involved in the CRTC setting the target guidelines of 50-10 for 90% of Canadians. And we know that although we've already invested that money, we're not likely to see 90% of our residents get there by 2021. In fact, we're not quite sure when we'll get there because only 36% of rural residents have access to those kind of speeds. So that's why we're doing this. And we were talking at lunch. I'll give you a really concrete example. There's a town called Apsley. It's between Peterborough and Bancroft in Eastern Ontario. 2,500 residents in the winter, about 12,000 in the summer, cottage country. Bank recently closed. Doctor moved into Peterborough. So the people that live in Apsley, whether they're there in the winter or the summer, if they don't have enough network coverage or there's not enough capacity in the cell network or coverage, they have to drive 45 minutes into Peterborough to go to the bank, cash a check, make a deposit, do a transfer, or same thing to get access to a doctor or to the hospital. So that's why we're doing this for our residents. And the last slide is, what are we proposing in terms of new innovative business models? So we formed this private-public partnership, and we are very respectful of our private sector partners. We don't aim to own the network. We think private sector companies do a great job of owning and operating networks, but what we try to do is determine where there's market failure. So we look at the supply of broadband, both fixed and mobile. We map that out. We look at demand and what the future demand expectations are, and are there any gaps? And where there's gaps, we cost that out, and we do an economic analysis, and we try to figure out if the private sector is going to go and build there, then we shouldn't be using public dollars to stimulate it. But if they're not, and if there's market failure, then that's when we put a project together to try and stimulate investment. So we are just about to embark on the next project, which is a $213 million cell and mobile project. We've gone through this process to determine market failure. We've identified the areas, and some of those areas are along the 401 corridors where there is no cell coverage, there is no mobile coverage, or there's not enough capacity in the network. So we're looking forward to moving forward with that project next, and that's where we're focused on in terms of network innovation.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks for that explanation. So at this point, we're going to get into I'll pose some questions to our panelists, and I'm hoping to get a little bit of bantering back and forth. So please, if you've got dissenting views or alternative opinions, by all means, weigh in. Maybe we'll have a little bit of a Republican versus Democrat debate going on here. So I'm going to start with you, Ray. A bit of a softball question, but please dive into it. So just in general, where do you think our industry, and particularly the telecom sector of that industry, is headed with networks? What are we doing there around innovation that's going to, knock the socks off of our customers?
So what's really happening right now, and I summarize this with three things. I start with flexibility, scalability, and cost. Those are the three things that's evolving. And for once right now is actually for our customers as well for the carrier operators. And when you think about those layers and when you start talking about flexibility, by centralizing some of service orchestration, our control of virtualize the network, give us a better capabilities on the operator side, but also drives our capability to drive faster service to our customers and scale our customer faster. When you look at the scalability, similarly, we could scale faster to grow our network, scale bandwidth faster for our customers, and those a lot of the scalability comes from. And the cost, a lot of time people talk about absolute cost. I would say because of the demand on the data and the bandwidth requirements, it's really more about cost per bit what's important for everybody. And this technology right now, by collapsing some of the layer that Brahim was talking to earlier, it's help us to improve our cost structure and also drive a better cost structure to our customers and give the ability, with SD-WAN also to leverage public and private networks to deliver services and back up each other and so on. So that's where we're evolving, and that's an exciting time for our industry because this is our next evolution technically, taking the network to the cloud as much as possible to a network to be in the cloud.
So in terms of the evolution and particularly the innovation, virtualizing the network has kind of become the theme of the day recently. It seems to be the topic everyone's talking about, and it translates to things like software-defined networks, software-defined everything, and also NFE, which is kind of the focus point of a lot of organizations today about how they're going to actually go and make all this stuff work. So, Brahim, I know you've kind of been in the news a little bit about this particular topic, and I'm not going to go down that path and get you any more trouble if whatever, but what I would like to know is where we are currently in the life cycle of this strategy. Are we in the trough of disillusionment? Is it living up to the hype? Do you anticipate, like every technology, it has to go through a maturity cycle. Are we eventually going to get there? And is it going to actually deliver on the goods that everyone has been promised?
I mean, I'm already in trouble, so we're good. If you look at NFV, network function virtualization, we look at it in 4 phases. The first phase was using common hardware. It's really no big deal. You just take everything the way it is and just use the same generic hardware. You get 15 to 20% savings. The next phase is using the same ops teams to leverage the multiple functions and multiple tenants. That's phase 2. And I think a lot of us are getting there or at that point in time. There's 2 more phases, and I'd like to share those. Not that the technology has let us down, but we're not there yet. One is if you use the same thing, the same protocols, what we call N+1, you're able to leverage across multiple constituents the capacity. So instead of each system or each network having double the capacity for reliability, you need only to back up one and then you can share. So that whole motion, that exercise of software-defined networking is not quite there yet with a lot of what we do. And the 4th phase, to be honest, and Chris talked about it this morning in Red Hat, we're not at the era of micro-containers in certain places. Like for most of us in Canada, I don't know if you know, I live in Edmonton, but in Canada, telecoms, there's 4 cities. Edmonton is not one of them. You guys know that, right? So Calgary and Vancouver back up each other, and Toronto backs up Montreal, and then if, God forbid what happens, they back things, right? But in theory, there is no reason why the Edmonton police force cannot talk to each other without going to Calgary or going to Vancouver or going to Toronto. So that part of NFV where you can scale down the functions and features, and I think Ray talked about it, to the cloud, to the edge is not there yet. So I think we're getting there. The total cost of ownership piece is not there yet, but we are, I think, around phase 2 if we're not lying to each other.
Cool, cool. So, James, you bring, I think, a little bit of an interesting perspective, given the fact that you're on the supplier.
He sent me a nasty email saying, I'm going to flame you on the panel, which
supplier side. So I'm interested to get your perspective, and then please anyone else weigh in. Is, now, given that we're going down this path of virtualizing the network, and we'll eventually get there, I suspect, may take a little longer than everyone would hope, but when that eventually, that reality happens, do you imagine that it's going to create a new set of competitors for traditional carriers like, you know, TELUS and Allstream, in terms of what that's going to offer? I mean, I give you an example. You know, do you imagine at some point that we might have the concept of a virtual network operator, much like we created the VoIP operators that came about even though they never had to really build any real technical infrastructure in order to deliver that service. So,
yeah, sure. I mean, I think in some happy way, it's actually it's a chance for the revenge of the network owner, in the sense that they've been dealing with the over-the-top providers coming in and stealing interesting revenue streams from their end customers for years now. But now with NFV, they can have a company like TELUS, right, might say there might be this or that company with a strong presence in my home office, in my geographic footprint, but they've got branch offices that are here, there, and everywhere. I can offer them the same packet services that I offer them on network. Now I can offer them off network, and I just tunnel it over somebody else's IP network or whatever the case may be. So we're seeing that a fair bit. Some of our early customers are in fact facility-free providers, or they're Verizon's an announced customer, right? And a lot of their wins are completely out of territory. They're winning in Europe with this offering, just because they can now use all of their network intelligence, their skills, their reach, their marketing, et cetera, to go out and offer services out of territory.
Okay.
So
do you have a similar? Go ahead.
Yeah. So I just want to bring like a little bit of the customer aspect of this. A lot of this with discussion here around what's the benefit of operator, but what's one nice thing about what's happening through this process is there's a lot of benefit to the customer throughout the process, from ability to have more control of their networks. With IoT coming and 5G coming, we expect much more complexity in the customer network going forward, but this virtualization, the vision behind it will help us simplify it to allow us to manage much more nodes than we ever managed before.
Ray, sorry. May I?
Please. Yeah. That's the whole point. I want to get some back and forth here.
I think I don't want to be too much of a geek. It's about the customer journey. And I agree. I think we're simplifying things for the customer. So if you are connected on the internet, you are a service provider. Anybody at home with a website is a service provider, and we need to make sure they're enabled. But I want to go back to the point that we mentioned. As we simplify, actually stuff is getting very complex. So when we talk about network transformation, network innovation, I think the back end with like all these moving pieces is not becoming simpler. So I think there's a lot of innovation in deployment, there's a lot of innovation in engineering, there's a lot of innovation in design. I think sometimes we think innovation is in the next widget that's going to come up. But to provide that simplified fashion that enables new business models, there's a lot of stuff that we need to do in the background. So I don't know if people will admit to it. So it might seem easy, but it is extremely complex. So you talked about the Etsy model. Jeez, have you seen how, like, there's like 89 things going together, and somebody says, look how easy. I said, what kind of blindness do you have? This is one of my peers, by the way.
Right. So do you imagine that because of that there's going to have to be a transformation in terms of how we operate these networks? Like,
I
how are we going to go about doing that with all this complexity?
I don't know about the rest of my colleagues, but you need to trust the systems. Like, you can't do static routing anymore. So I'll give you a small example of a city like Edmonton. We used to have 100 base stations. We're going to have 10,000, 50,000. You can't have a guy going around driving, oh, how's the signal? Is it optimal? Let me optimize. You'll spend all your life driving a friggin' car, right? Like, you got to trust the systems that it's self-optimizing, self-healing, right? So these things, they also require a cultural shift. So I don't know about your networks. Today, our guys like to be personally involved. How do I tell them you got to assume it'll take care of itself, right? I don't know what other
Well, so
people-
given that complexity, and I'll throw this to David, and it may or may not fall within your domain given your organization, but how do things like AI and machine learning and the automation aspect of what this is supposedly promising, how is that going to address the problem that you just described, that we've got such a complex system that we're building through these technologies? We're obviously, one would expect that the services that we're going to offer the marketplace should be phenomenal compared to even what we have right now. But everything doesn't come for free. There's always a cost. So whatever you get on one side, you're paying for on the other side. And it seems to me right now, even from our experience, we're observing the fact that organizations are really struggling to see, you know, at least at this point, the full manifestation of the value of what these technologies are, the potential of them. And we all know and expect that they're going to get there eventually, but we're a ways away. So how does something like AI play a role in maybe moving us forward quicker?
Well, I think the technologies can always support new business models, right? Even in rural areas, I don't know how many of you know, but we have farms in Eastern Ontario that are, the cows milk themselves now. It's all automated. When they're ready to be milked, they go into the barn. The farmers don't touch the cows. That whole process happens on its own. The farmer's got an app on their phone and they're tracking all of that. In order for that to be successful, they need to have the network capacity to deal with all of that. But I think the thing that underlines that in terms of the new business models is also there has to be a willingness for something, maybe I'll call it co-opetition. Sometimes you're going to be competing against each other. Sometimes you really need, in order to maximize the new technology and to add value, you need to find different ways to work together. And that's what, you know, that's what I think we're trying to do in our areas by forming a private-public partnerships and looking for different partners that are willing to work together to maximize the advantages from the new technologies.
I'm going to come back to the private-public thing in a second here, but you did mention about the, you know, volume of data, and I know it's been talked about here on a couple of panels, and people have talked about it in their presentations, but, you know, IoT is top of mind. The numbers I'm reading are 25 billion IoT connections by 2025. I don't know what that translates to in the Canadian marketplace, but it's still going to be an order of magnitude from what we're dealing with today. So what is it that we're going to have to do as an industry, you as operators, to basically build out that capacity to service the amount of data that's going to be pushed through those wires and signals and you know, to be able to handle the volume? Because one thing I've discovered over my time in this year, when it comes to data, humans have an insatiable appetite, and when you think they're going to require 100, they'll prove you wrong and say they need 1,000. So how are we going to get past the challenges to be able to build out that in a timely fashion? And I'll give it to you again, David. Let you carry that on, and then I'll ask the other gentleman here as well,
I'll
too.
start because I think one of the things is they have to find a way to monetize IoT, because all of that data doesn't, you know, it can't run for free and sustain the networks, especially in our areas where we live. Like we understand the massive amount of investment that's required to get the network out there to build that capacity. And I think and when there's market failure, when there's areas where you can't build that on your own, it's forming those kind of unique partnerships to be able to do that.
I can jump in. I think that monetization is exactly the key, right? I mean, that data exists. You've got all these packet services today. You could collect a whole bunch of stats and plug up the network, backhauling all that to some central server. But by and large, they don't. Service monitoring is relatively underinvested because it's tough to prove the investment's worth it when you've got a whole bunch of other demands. So yeah, monetization is exactly the key. And I do think feeding it up to some AI will be part of the answer, and then maybe Facebook will sell it off to Cambridge Analytica or somebody and find a way to govern our votes.
I'm
sure TELUS doesn't do that.
We don't actually. I unequivocally say we don't throttle the internet. We don't monitor the internet. In 2000, we said we believe it's about the internet, but that's not what I was going to say. I agree with you, which is all true, by the way. But I think the problem is it's so easy to. This is my problem with vendors, and please, a lot of you are ex-colleagues, so take it with a grain of salt. It's so easy to say, oh yeah, but you know, you can sell this. No, I can't sell this. Like, do we have the right sales team? Do we talk to the right people? Like, it's so easy to come up with these, but you can sell something like ads. So let me give you a small example. So you do know a lot of the programming in Canada is from the US, right?
Of course.
I love Murdoch Mysteries, and there's like 3 shows I watch, Canadian shows that are fantastic. But there are 24 hours in the day, and I tend to tune to a lot of the American channels, right? So let's be very honest. We are not obligated to take the commercials. You know that, right? That sounds fantastic, right? Like I get a feed, and I have 6 minutes I could sell. That's a great monetization opportunity. There's not one person to tell us that knows who the hell do they sell these free commercial spots to. Forget about the technology. So I think one of the things when we talk about commercialization, I think it's critical to look at, is it our core business or how do we do partnerships? And it goes back to, we're all wholesalers at some level, and that's what's going to help with the monetization. And we're retailers at the same time. So when we talk about our business model changing, it's very critical to accommodate these because the ability to blanket out a commercial is there. The question is, who do I sell it to? Like we can put some TELUS animals and bunnies like for hours and hours, which are really cute, but even I get sick of them, right? Like it's just, so I think it's very important to keep it in check in terms of either the partnerships or the ecosystems. And I agree with you, like the monetization opportunities are everywhere. The question is, are we able to leverage it? Like you guys must see them like crazy.
Yeah. So one of the things, monetization is always an interesting discussion because just because we have the network, we might not be into doing everything for everyone. We need to focus on what's our core business. It really become to an ecosystem and partnership programs that we need to work together in the industry to allow us to monetize. We may not monetize directly to the customer because if it's not our core business, we're never going to be successful at. The other thing I want to bring to that is automation is important. Ibrahim, you touched on that one earlier. It's the volume of data, the volume of data, bandwidth and data as intelligent data, artificial intelligent data you will be able to collect. It's great, but if you don't automate it and link it to self-healing or self-assessing situations, that's not useful for us. Right? Reality is right now we need to move away from just monitoring a network to actually intelligently manage a service. And really that comes in with its own set of integration between the network layer and the IT layers, for lack of better.
So, following on kind of that thought process, then, and I'll go back to you, Ray, just to continue your thought processes. So what do you think the biggest challenge is going forward as these networks evolve and they become, virtualized and software defined? Is it the scalability question that's, the biggest issue? Is it security? Is it keeping the lights on?
So the simple answer all, but let me kind of give you my personal opinion. A couple areas is security is definitely front and center for all of us in the industry. It's a very important part of the puzzle. We need to make sure with a lot of more data available, a lot of risk is there, so we need to stay on top of that and have again automated way to mitigate potential risks. So that's very important for us. Scalability, it's not the technical part. It's really about a services type of frame end to end, because from a technology, we even earlier today we're talking about 5G and capability of delivering bigger bandwidth on wireless, and in my mind I say finally the mobile network became an extension of the network, which is a great thing to do. So the bandwidth technology is getting there. Now the question is how you connect it all together. The promise is really the NFV of the world and the SD-WAN, but we just need to make sure that actually happens. A lot of it, theoretically on paper it should work, but we haven't seen it in action yet, and we haven't seen the complexities going to drive in order for us to address those complexities and make it a model that works for everyone.
Well, but I mean that there's more. Sorry to interject. I think when we talk about security, we mention it, but I agree with you. And not because we have a fantastic CSO at TELUS, but I think it's everywhere. And I think when we talk about privacy, we can't talk about security without privacy. So, I mean, I don't know who in this room was surprised Facebook information was used. Like whoever was surprised, let me tell you, I got a great piece of real estate, which is 3 hours north of Edmonton. And it's got a great feature. It's got snow 8 months out of the year. You can't beat that anywhere. And it's a deal. So like I was watching the US Senate hearings, and I was actually, first of all, intrigued because it was fascinating. Then it was better than Seinfeld reruns because these people were asking stupid questions. Well, you mean you're using my data?
Of course.
I unfriended myself 8 years ago when I landed in London, and it gave me a recommendation for a restaurant. So I'm not saying I'm unique or I'm special, but I'm saying if you actually care about your privacy, you shouldn't be surprised, right? And then Zuckerberg did a brilliant thing for Canada and the world in general. He's the largest service provider in the world, but he doesn't believe in privacy, period. He stated that publicly. So I don't know why the hell people are surprised. So when I agree with Ray, as we open up everything to everybody and you can peer, if it's something we care about, we need to get together either as an industry or with regulators and say, there's got to be a framework for privacy, a framework for data, a framework for trust. Mind you, the new generation, like my nephews and nieces,
They don't care.
oh yeah, my mother broke her leg, and my father, he's an idiot, he was drunk last night. I was like, what the hell is that? Like, there's no shame. So I don't know, maybe my age group is just not looking at the right things, and really Zuckerberg is right. But if that's the case, maybe you can help me fight my case in Alberta because I don't own my own medical record. And by the way, the Alberta Medical Association is 2 floors down from me in the same building. So we fight every day, we meet in the morning.
So if I can just jump in, I
Please.
think one of the biggest challenges is actually a short-term one, and I hate to say it, but I actually agree with something you said a while ago.
Agree something?
Yeah,
Oh.
miracles can happen. But I think in the short term, there's a management system transformation, an OSS, BSS type transformation, right? So a whole bunch of network operators heard about all this cool new technology, great, and if I implement this stuff, I'm gonna be just like Facebook and Google, right? Wrong, right? Because you still have all that same crap in the back office. And there's another transformation that has to happen there. It's not rocket science, it's hard work. They will get through it, and then they'll be on a much lighter footing. But there's a second phase of the battle to come, which is that one. And it's gonna be a tough slog.
It will be.
Yeah. Just a couple notes. So we, just like all the other panel sessions, we'll open up the floor here in a few minutes to audience questions. So please prepare your thoughts about that. But I will ask.
I have a question for James, because he's the only vendor and we can gang up on him here.
Oh, geez, here we go.
One of the challenges is everything is flat. So it's not a sob story. I get paid well, TELUS is doing well. But ARPU's been the same, even though bandwidth for the consumer has gone on the wireline from 1.5 meg to 150 meg. And on the wireless, remember the old days of CDMA and 56 kilobits per second, you can hit 300 meg, right? So I'm not complaining, life is wonderful, but the reality is the revenue is still the same.
Yeah.
So even though the price per bit's dropped and whatnot, like our ARPU is still around 60 bucks. Have you, and James, you as the industry and the vendor community.
All of it.
I'm not putting you in the hot seat, especially after that nasty email you sent me the other day. How do you envision with our flat stuff a business model to help us bridge the divide? So I'm with you, and I think we will emerge looking different than we are today. And I think we all said that. But how are you going to help? Because our revenue is not going up, but we're doing something completely different. Like, we can only tighten our belt so much. What is your thought? And I know it's not fair, but I love asking the questions.
I never thought you'd serve up a softball like that. That's beautiful. So I think
and we don't buy stuff from them, FYI, so.
the obvious answer is that you replace your existing bloated fat cat vendors with lean, mean ones like us.
Touche, touche.
And
That's all I got.
IDX is one of my partners.
So we'll get people to ask some questions here in a second, but I do have one more question. I want to direct it over to you, David, and that is, so here we are. We want to move the network forward as quickly as possible. So what do we got to do? What are the keys to accelerating this evolution, right? So everybody wants things faster, quicker, sooner. Is it capital? I mean, I know in your case, given the nature of your business, getting funding is obviously a key component to it, but what about human resources? Do we have the access to the people to make this happen? Do we have the skills? Do we need to go and look for vehicles to get our resources higher educated in terms of the stuff that we're trying to do as an industry in evolving the network? Or should we be looking at demand? Is it the business demand, the consumer demand that should be driving the speed at which the evolution happens? Because there's all kinds of variables in the mix here. Which are the ones do you think are the most important to make this go forward?
Yeah, I think one of the last things that you touched on was demand, and I think not everything that's connected should be connected. The part we were talking about monetizing and IoT, just because you can connect it doesn't mean you should. So much of the innovation that we see is supply side driven. I got a great idea for a new widget. I'm going to go out there and become the next Google, Apple, Microsoft, whatever they want to become. I think there's a huge opportunity for all of our partners along the way in the ecosystem to go out and talk to customers and figure out what they really need to help them add value. And that will spur innovation almost faster than anything else. And that will help to figure out what things should be connected and what things could wait for a while, let's say.
It's the age-old, just because you can doesn't mean you should, right?
That's right.
Anyone else have any thoughts about that at all that want to pipe in?
Oh, we agree with you.
Yeah. I'll ask anyone that is interested in asking a question to step up to the mic, but I'll continue on while you do that. So I wanted to jump in a little bit about 5G. I know it's a topic on everybody's mind, and one of the questions I have, and it's somewhat self-fulfilling in my interest, is there an expectation, and I'll throw this to you initially, Brahim, but please everyone else weigh in, is the virtualization of the network a critical component to see 5G manifest into the realities that everyone is hoping it will, or not?
I'd like to answer the question in two parts. If you view 5G as the evolution of 4G from a wireless interface point of view, no. If you view 5G as transformative in terms of how you would build a next-gen city, how you would build a network, how you build a neighborhood, the answer is yes. Because if you look at what the Koreans did with centralized DRAN when they backhauled, they decoupled the radio from where you optimize baseband units. Not to geek myself to death, but they actually were able to have a machine optimize 1,200 base stations and how customers go across. That is very critical when you talk about thousands, and I love the billions of connected devices because, it's like every vendor, except you guys, wants to outdo themselves. So Ericsson says we have 1 billion connected devices. Cisco says 5 billion. Nokia does 10, so now they're at 25 billion. So I'm waiting for next year to see what the number will be. I don't really care how many billion devices. All I know is that when you have 10,000 plus connected devices in a neighborhood, which is very possible in a little metro city, you need that compute to be able to optimize the experience across multiple devices and multiple users. That being the case, NFV in the metro mobile edge, like everybody talked about this morning, is critical to enable that right. So it's a matter of reality. But if all you wanted to go do, say, I've gone from 100 meg to 500 meg, you're fine. Relax, wait for the next iPhone or Samsung.
Do you think that's going to be the focus, though? I mean, in order to be competitive in this market, just dealing with the one side.
I mean, we have, like, humbly speaking, we've failed a number of times in certain areas till we refine what we call as a story for what 5G will be disruptive to transform. And that is our path. I don't know what other people's path in terms of cost of ownership, in terms of transforming and upskilling their employees. 5G for us is wireless wireline. It's just not just an access technology.
Okay.
I would just say from our side, having spoken to a number of wireless vendors, the industry is all over the map, right? And for reasons of personal opinion and for reasons of geography and served areas. In some cases, it makes sense to keep your existing service footprint. I'm going to go just as an evolution of air interfaces, but otherwise leave things alone. In other cases, yeah, I'm actually going to backhaul, or I'm going to use all these fantastic new technologies, split 2, split 7, blah, 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 and come back to a CRAN. So There's all kinds of innovation happening there, and there'll be experimentation, I think, for most of the next 5 years until a model's really settled on.
Perfect, perfect. So I see we have a gentleman out here. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Fascinating topic. I'm Paul. I'm from Northern Ontario, rural. And one of the challenges is not that there's existing infrastructure. There is a facet of my question that's tied to that, and it's tied to telecom and DSL. Right now, we know that CRTC has a new target that the majority of our country will be hopefully at 50 down, 10 up by 2021. And there's no roadmap as to what happens thereafter for those that are not in that 90 original percent. I am fascinated with what EORN has been able to achieve. However, in the north, where population densities in our area are fairly low, 200,000 square kilometers has 150,000 inhabitants. That's not easy to interconnect, whether wireless or wireline. So one facet is to say, well, how can we innovate to get to the next when it comes to replacing DSL where there's no competing infrastructure that is more capable? And is there something that can be innovative in our thought processes between public-private partnerships where the government step in to address where there really isn't that monetization and profitability for traditional ISPs to deliver such services for those that are starving for it as well?
Sounds like a perfect question directed to you,
Promise
David.
not to ask me any technical questions. Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I would suggest the path that we've been on is there's been lots of different government funding programs, CTI, previous ones, and I think what we've tried to advocate for is be strategic, use market failure as a basis for innovation, and all three levels of government plus the private sector need to work together in order to solve that problem. The CRTC suggested, I think, to reach all Canadians, something around $6 billion, and the new fund is supposed to be $750 million over 5 years. We hired two different economists and telecom economists, and our own estimates, if you took just our geographic area and population and modeled that for the rest of Canada, we figured somewhere between $6 and $11 billion. So no level of government's going to do that on their own. The private sector is not going to do that on their own. We need to keep figuring out new and creative ways to work together to get the new technologies out there.
I'm going to be, so I want to give you a small example. And I think it's a wonderful place where you live. But the most dense city, which is parts of Vancouver in Canada, are 1/17 the density of a typical dense city in Europe. So even in urban Canada, we have an issue with coverage. And if you look at the cost to service somebody in that part, you are probably 125x more cost effective. So in a place where there's the commitment to the citizens, like we're fiberizing our community. So TELUS started with Tier 3 on purpose to prove a point. But even those, once you hit the township, is more dense than the areas you're talking about. I think you do need, like we actually on purpose started our fiber to the home program in Tier 3 cities because we felt they were underserved, but there was no ROI. And not to complain about the regulators, I've done enough so far. But they moved, if they open up competition on those lines, they move the return on investment from 11 years to 21 years. I'm giving you an example, places like Drayton Valley, like Terrace, BC, Drayton Valley, Alberta. So I don't know what Ontario looks like, but it's very tough. There clearly is no commitment on behalf of the government for rural Canada. It's things we do ourselves. I think the proof is in the pudding, regardless of what's being said. I know it's unpopular, but I think we need to show the commitment through more than the deferral account if we want to do that. So you cannot use the same equation for urban Canada as rural Canada and expect the ROI. And there's been no tax breaks, for example. And the math is there, it's public. We can share it as you go from 11 years return on investment to 20 years. So I ask everybody in this room one question. If it was your money, where would you invest it? If it was your money, the gentleman from Northern Ontario, where would you put it, in the 11 years or 21 years?
Yeah, and the challenge that we've seen is that, again, we've been working in provincial and federal. We used to be unique in the idea of having FedNor stepping in from a federal perspective, and they stepped away from these types of investments. And from Ottawa to rural Ontario, the communication channels are not as they had previously been with that particular part of the government. So I do respect that, and there is no easy solution, because even talking with ISPs, 100% funding from a public perspective, operating what would be built otherwise is still not feasible. So how do we bridge that gap to make sure that we don't have a two-tier society where those that have and others that have not?
100%.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. We're down to a 5-minute countdown here. Is there anyone else that has a question or two? A couple seconds. So no. So what I'll do now is if I can give maybe just each of you about a minute just to kind of wrap up and give me your thoughts about network innovation in general, and where do you think the world's headed?
Geez. So I guess, you know, at the end of the day, you talk all this technology, blah, blah, blah. And I'm sometimes guilty of drinking my own Kool-Aid. But nonetheless, it is very exciting. With all this innovation that we've seen in the cloud, it is coming to telecommunications networks. It'll be rocky and there'll be fits and starts, but all of the services that you're going to be getting in the next 10 years, say, is going to be cloud delivered, right? It might be a very small cloud sitting on your premises, might be a cloud in a data center that Brahim owns, or it might be something up that Zuckerberg owns. It's all coming. Things will be changing faster and faster and faster, and all of that sort of quickness that we've come to expect from our iPhones and from the web is coming to telecom services, and that's a lot of fun.
What about you, Brahim?
I mean, I'd echo what James said. We're drinking from a fire hose. I think I have the best job in the world. Like, it's great to be a geek when things are changing. I do believe, though, it's very easy to be terribly excited without a template and a roadmap. And I think it's critical to make sure how it aligns with where we want to take our end subscribers and customers. It's a lot of fun. You'll see a lot of really cool stuff happening, and hopefully TELUS will be part of it.
Ray.
So I'm going to start where you left. I think it's a lot of fun, a lot of exciting things happening. But if you look backward 10 years ago and you look where you are today, we always surprise ourselves when we see how things evolve. Things will evolve most probably faster than we expect today, and slower than we really like, but somewhere along the way. But technology right now, we're in the telecom industry, and with the over-the-top and all the dynamic of our industry, we definitely have to be innovative, and we'll need to continue to stay innovative to stay delivering service to our customers. So that's.
And you, David, again, you have a bit of a unique situation kind of governing this public-private thing. What do you imagine is the future, and how is it going to affect you?
I just keep encouraging people to think beyond the technology in order to allow the networks to continue to evolve and innovate, and ensure that there's opportunities for partnership and look at different business models, because if we want all Canadians to participate in the economy, whether it's fixed or mobile, however, accessing their bank, getting their medical records eventually, then we need to develop partnerships between government and the private sector and break down some of the barriers and the silos between the kind of us and them. We're private, you're public. No, we need to work together to get people access to.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. I'll leave you all with one thought, though, before we leave today. As I was thinking about getting involved in this situation, it harkened up an old memory about the network. And I don't know if you all recall, I don't think you have to be that old to recall this, but there was a pretty famous tech guy back in the day that once claimed that the network was the computer, or would be the computer. And it seems to me that the way the innovation is happening now, at the speed that's happening, we may be getting closer to that reality than we ever have. So it's going to be a real interesting ride, I think, going forward. So thank you very much. If you guys give our panelists a round of applause, hopefully you enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.